Hey people, we are now on to the second half of chapter 2. We're going to talk about the Romans, and of course, we have to talk about the precursor to the Romans, just like we with the Greeks. So we're also going to talk about the Etruscans. And the crazy part is, you saw Greek already, and you will see that much of what the Greeks did, the Romans just interpreted. And the styles that Greeks and Romans use were really just called classical styles. So we'll get some of the influence of classical styles in this chapter, right? But, the themes really for this is the cross-culturalness, right, of Roman and Greek dress. Of course, they had some overlap in time, but really just that they borrowed from each other. And of course, we know that the Greeks borrow from the Egyptians, right? So it's an evolutionary process. So we'll look at that cross-cultural theme. In this section, this part of the lecture on Rome, we're also going to talk about the role that politics played in Roman dress. And and when I say politics, it's in part conquest, but also how the political players at the time were able to dress. So that kind of ties into the social roles. There was a lot of social stratification in Rome, and as a result, there were explicit rules on who could wear what. So that's what we're going to talk about this time. We're going to build some correlations between the Greeks and Romans. We're going to talk about their styles of dress. We're going to, of course, look at some pictures. And I promise for the next video, my face gonna show up back at the bottom when we get to our next lecture for the next module. Okay, dive in. All right, so where do we start? We, of course, are going to start with a little history. It's probably going to be more slides than you probably want, and I really wish I could pare it down, but there's so much history with the Romans. And first, we're going to start with the first Roman people. Actually, before we even start about the Roman people, let's talk about the Greeks for a little bit. So Greek influence was still very strong on the Italian peninsula, and the first people that we have on the Italian peninsula are actually called the Etruscans. And the Etruscans were their culture developed about 800 BCE, so that was really, really early on, right along the lines that Greece started and began to reach its peak. So the Etruscans were the first people that were eventually overcome by the more powerful Roman neighbors. So we'll talk about how they were taken over first. But Roman dress is similar to both Greek and Etruscan forms. And looking at the next couple pictures slides we're going to look at with the Etruscans, you can see how they borrowed directly from each other. So they wear tunics and chittons, and it's Greek dress just on the Italian peninsula. So we will definitely look at that. Roman clothing just incorporated some more elements, and when we get to the Romans, we'll see how they took the Greek and Etruscan elements and really put some social stratification on it, right? So how Roman dress, using the Etruscans and the Greeks as a baseline, how they modified that dress to impose or to show your social status. Your precursor that I started in the previous slide is that the earliest people on the Roman Peninsula were called the Etruscans, and the Roman people actually called them the Etruscans, and we don't know if that's what they actually called themselves, but there definitely is proof that Greek colonies have been established in Sicily and in southern Italy, and by the 8th century, about 800 BC, Greeks had definitely reached the northern limits of their colonization and the southern boundary of Italy. And Greeks called this area Etruria, which in turn is why the Romans called them the Etruscans. Like I said, we're not sure that the Etruscans actually called themselves that. That's what the Greeks called them, and then the Romans adopted that. You will see a lot of adaptation from Greek when we talk about these Roman people. Um, but those early occupants of the Italian peninsula um, are 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 thought to have migrated from places like Africa and Sicily, which is an island in the Mediterranean, and Spain and France, and as far north as Switzerland. But they left no written records and are really just known through archaeological remains. But what we do know about the Etruscans is that they tilled the soil, right? So they farmed, they wove clothing. So they also used wool. We'll talk about that in a little bit. They wove fabric to make clothing, and they made pottery and bronze implements, and those implements are tools and also some jewelry. So those are some of the things that we know about the Etruscans. So let's talk about this little guy here on the screen. This is a figure from Cyprus. It is dated between the 7th and 6th century BCE, and he is wearing a pretty much a tunic and a loincloth. So and it is believed that the bands around his arms are jewelry. They're artistic decorations that we would put on ourselves. And this is the type of garment that we know that the Greeks wore as well. If we look at his headpiece, it looks like it since there's not hair showing, it looks like it is decorative as well. And this image is actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So if you look at this, it has a very strong Greek influence if we compare it to some of the images that we saw in the Greek lecture. Again, we're going to see a very strong Greek influence. I'm going to say that throughout, especially talking about the Etruscans, but even when we get to the Romans, strong Greek influence. But what archaeologists have been able to find about the Etruscans is that there were about 18 fortified cities that they have found that are not of Roman origin, that are of Etruscan origin, and that those cities were ruled by kings and nobles, and they formed a loose confederation. So that is how they were not a country, right? They were just a civilization of loosely confederated cities, right? The Etruscans, though, they left a lot of records of their lives in wall paintings, in statues, and in objects that they placed in the tombs. It was called necropolis, right? Necropoli, which are cities of the dead, right? Cemeteries, basically. And the image that we see here is a terracotta shape of an Etruscan woman. This is a terracotta statuette that was a depiction of the person that was in the necropolis. Actually, much like the Egyptians, they created what were called sarcophagus or sarcophagi. So basically a very elaborated coffin, right? So this terracotta sculpture was on top of one of the sarcophagi. So very elaborate. If we look at her, she's in a lounging seated position. You can tell she's probably a woman of wealth or noble heritage. She is wearing her chiton, like we've seen, right? She has jewelry. She has on bracelets and a necklace and a ring, and she's wearing a tiara, and her hair is really in a very Greek style. Like if I hadn't have told you that this was a Greek figurine, if I had told you this is a Greek figurine, you probably would have just thought it was Greek, but it is an Etruscan style. So one thing that archaeologists have been able to determine about the Etruscans, about their family life based on the art that we have found left behind, is that women seem to have occupied a position of greater importance in Etruscan society than they did in either Greek and later Roman. So it seems as if women were more of an equal than they were in the Roman world. And we talked about in the Greek world how they were the property of their of the men in their lives. And when we get to Rome, we will kind of see the same thing. But you know, many of the many of the art that we found have been in these buried cities of the dead, these necropoli, and we see a lot of depictions of family group, and we see women, you know, getting a privileged status. We see in some of the funerary statues and paintings, we see men and women together in this type of lounging position, and you know, even in family groups, we see a warmth and affection. So there actually are some discovered statues of children that are just, you know, kind of realistic for them to be more than 2,000 years old. So, in addition, Etruscan art showed, again, strong Greek influences, um, especially the further along you get in the history. So the closer you get to the Common Era. So in the 500, in the 600 and 500 BCEs, when we know that Greek colonies were established in southern Italy. So it is very clear that Greece and the Greeks and the Etruscans had an active and close trading relationship. Okay, I'm not gonna say it. I can't say I'm not gonna say it again. I'm gonna say it again. The Etruscans and the Greeks borrowed from each other, and they actually wore the same style. So if we look at this image again at the top, on the left hand side, this is actually another Etruscan sarcophagus. The woman is obviously wearing a chiton. This one is a purple bordered chiton that's draped around her body and over her shoulders and drawn over her hair. And if we think back to what Greeks wore for their weddings, right, that's exactly what they wore, just the veil was saffron colored instead. But, you know, very reminiscent of what we saw at the Greeks. And, you know, archaeologists believe that some believe that they adopted each other's styles from trading and interacting with each other. There are some archaeologists believe that they may have borrowed this from a third source, so maybe from the Egyptians or from trading along the Silk Road, that it may have come from the Middle East or India. But obviously they borrowed from each other, because this image of this woman in the sarcophagus is the same image that we've seen of the Greek women that we saw earlier. So again, chitons were worn in Etruscan society, and they're often difficult to tell apart. However, Etruscan chitons consistently tended to be shorter and not as voluminous, so just a little bit less fabric than the Greeks. The Etruscans also appear to have cut and sewn sleeves into the garment that gave it just a much closer fit and less of a draped appearance. Archaeologists could believe that it could be because of the differences in climate, or just the differences in lifestyle, just how the Greeks and Etruscans lived, and upper crust Etruscan ladies also consistently are pictured with a fringe or a tassel that hung down at the front and the back of each shoulder. And if we think about, we saw Mycenaean and Greek men also wear tassel around their waist. That was a weighted tassel. So interesting to see that as well. Varieties, you know, of Etruscan dress are of course, they're in linen, they're in wool, they're in cotton, they're in silk, right? So they are in all of the iterations of the fabrics that we know were being used at the time. Etruscans too wore tunics. It was just called something different. It's called a tabina, and you know, it probably you know, just was borrowed. It was just borrowed. It was just a different version of what the Greeks wore. And in the next slide, we're going to look at the different versions of what they wore for a tunic, and a cloak, and how they draped it. They did drape it differently than the Greeks. Now let's look at some variations of what the Etruscans wore that was slightly different than what the Greeks wore. So we have three images here. The first one is a woman. The last two are men. The first one is a woman. She is wearing, if we think about it, just a variation of the chitin, right? But of course they called it a tabina. It is a cape-like garment that is worn by women, and it had long tabs hanging down the front. So it was an overgarment, right? Next, the men wore a version of the tabina as well, but they wore it with the curved edge hanging down the front, and then the two ends thrown over the shoulder. So same garment, just wore in a different manner. And then third, right, is what has thought to have been the precursor of the toga. So again, that semicircular garment draped over the body, just in a different manner than we see before. And this garment has really been thought to have been a symbol of Roman citizenship early on. So under the Etruscans, obviously they weren't Roman citizens yet, but as a Roman, only Roman citizens were allowed to wear the toga. And we're going to talk about that when we get to the Romans in just a few minutes. So much like we saw an evolution, right, of what the Greeks wore, we see an evolution of what the Etruscans wore, and that's just being the baseline for ultimately what the Greeks are gonna wear and what we will deem as classical Greek clothing.